o'clock. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you again for coming. Thank you so much. I'm so thrilled by both the turnout and the number of people who've been asking really challenging questions for me and for Dr. Rohlwink, both during the lecture as well as after. So that's great. It just shows that you're ready for Neurosurgery 101. Next week we can start you on some of the basic operations. Today I'm going to talk about. So I must apologize first. There are a whole bunch of things that I'd like to talk about. Lots of ideas circulating in my head. I'm going to have a pressure of ideation. There are going to be thoughts popping in and popping out. It may not seem terribly seamless, but there's a lot more that I'd like to say than I have time to say it, so that might be the consequence. But I wanted to start first with a couple of disclaimers. Today I'm going to talk about how we've come about understanding the brain. A little bit about the history of it, the things that have happened, the things that have advanced our understanding of the brain and the process thereof. But a couple of disclaimers first. So apropos my discussion about surgeons and their personalities on Monday, I have to declare, as much as it pains me, that I don't know everything. And even if I did, we wouldn't be able to cover everything. So I'm largely sticking to the things that we know about the brain. There are a whole bunch of topics that we aren't tackling. So one of them, the big one, is consciousness. And consciousness is not for mere mortals. There have been people who, very, very smart people, much smarter than me, who have applied their minds to the issue of consciousness, the mind contemplating the mind for millennia, and we know closer. Lots of theories about consciousness, some plausibility to some of those theories, but we're still nowhere closer, so they're theories, they're not hard facts. And as one commentator said, they're only fools and Nobel laureates who apply their minds to consciousness. And in fact, one of our famous neurosurgeons who developed the technique of directly stimulating the brain, as a young man, he said, you know that when a scientist starts applying his or her mind to philosophy, that they're over the hill. And as an older man, that's exactly what he did also. So we're not going to tackle some of those things unless I can tell you definitively that this is true or this isn't true. And following on that, my other disclaimer is that I'm a materialist. So there are many people, and I'm sure many of you, who are interested in the immaterial brain, the duality between mind and brain, the ghost in the machine. And so my disclaimer is that I don't know, but I suspect that we are material, that we are organic. And I can't prove that. I can't prove that there's no ghost in the machine, that there's no spirit. I can't prove that there is or there isn't a heavenly being, because there may be a ghost in the machine, there may be a heavenly being. I certainly don't have the knowledge, and I haven't met anyone or listened to anyone who has the knowledge to prove or disprove it. So I acknowledge that is where it's at. So there may be immaterial things, but based on our long arc of knowledge over millennia, and where we've come from, where we didn't know things, and to where we are, where we do know much more, and how we got there, the arc is really a line that leads us towards the understanding that there's a biological substrate to all the things that at one point we thought were mysterious. So epilepsy, centuries ago, was thought to be demon possession and falling down sickness. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Now we know it's much more prosaic than that. It's electricity in the brain. It's completely uncontrolled. It can be treated, it can even be cured. It's not demonic possession. That goes through many aspects, not only of the brain, but of the human body as well. Every time we thought there was a mystery, we've gotten to a point where we're able to explain it. Now, that doesn't mean we should be disappointed in that. It's not that it's prosaic or mundane just because we understand it. In fact, I would argue that having understood more of the brain than we did several centuries ago, we are invited to marvel at the wonder of it all so much more so than we ever would have known. So just understanding and knowing something and knowing there's a biological, physical substrate does not mean we stop in our wonder at all. So those are my disclaimers. And I want to talk about how we've gone through this process of discovering the brain. And it would be very nice to be able to say that it proceeded in a very orderly way, that all the things that we learned about the brain were a function of good scientific method, people applying their minds and then progressively, incrementally discovering more and more about the brain. And that is the process that we're going to follow in the years in the future. But unfortunately, that's not the case. And when you look at our history of discovery in the brain, the vast majority of it, the vast majority of the useful things that we've learned about the brain have mostly been accidental. We've progressed in fits and starts with long periods of inactivity in between. And there have been what I call happy or unhappy accidents, usually unhappy for the person involved and happy for the rest of humanity. And this has become just one of my favorite quotes. I've known it for a very long time. Louis Pasteur, of course, of pasteurization of milk. He says, in the field of observation, chance favors the prepared mind. And this you'll just see time and time again, things happen, and there happens to be a prepared mind that isn't lost, where the significance of that event isn't lost. So there are lots of things that we can do in neuroscience and our interface with patients at the moment. So we've got long-standing research projects in our department of various ways of monitoring the brain when the brain's injured. Doesn't matter what kind of acute injury. So you can monitor pressure inside the brain and how much oxygen is getting into the brain and the brain temperature and the brain blood flow and the brain chemistry, the lactate and the pyruvate, and you can look at all sorts of inflammatory mediators in the brain in direct time. Kinds of things that wouldn't have been possible even 20 years ago. We've got great imaging of the brain. You've got to remember that it was still within your generation, when you were growing up, that we had no way of imaging the brain. That it was pre the computerized tomography or the CAT scan of the brain and then the MRI scan. But prior to that, neurosurgeons and neurologists were doing x-rays which only showed you the bone. They had no idea what they were seeing until they opened the skull. And that was within one generation ago. And now we've got tremendous imaging abilities, tremendous ways of looking at the physical substrate of the brain and the functional substrate of the brain. In our operating theatre, so one of the things that is a passion of mine. So again, when I trained in neurosurgery, this wasn't available. I introduced it probably about 10 years ago. It's a way of, at least here in South Africa, it's a way of monitoring the electricity in the central nervous system. Because the whole of the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord is electricity. It's amazing. It's very complicated electricity, and how that electricity gets interpreted as wetness and dryness and pressure and pain and all of that's complicated, but you can narrow it down to electricity and the principles of electricity, the principles of current and voltage and impedance. It's electricity. And so you can hook patients up. We give them 500-600 volts, but at really low current. And you can monitor the electrical signals in an intact pathway from the brain to the foot, or sensory from the foot to the brain while you're operating in between. Those are things that just weren't available less than a generation ago. And we get all these electrical signals that we're watching while we're operating. And then we've got no idea where it's going. We're tremendously excited about how neuroscience is going to impact health and rehabilitation, and also our interaction with the environment, the interfaces between us as a computer and the physical computer. It raises all sorts of questions about consciousness. I mean, are we just a mass of very, very, very complicated algorithms, similar to the algorithms that can be developed for artificial intelligence? It's a massively expanding field. It's terribly exciting. We have got no idea where it's going. But we didn't start there. So I'm going to go back to where we started. And the earliest record of where we started was with these skulls. So they're somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 years ago. And the amazing thing about these skulls is that they've got openings in them. And those openings aren't random trauma-related openings. They are surgical openings. So there are two remarkable things about this. One is that they were being done, and we don't quite know why, because somebody cut a hole in there. This is from Peru, by the way. But you find these skulls in other parts of, so it's not just South America, you find them in Europe, and probably the oldest skulls, the best preserved ones are from Peru, but probably the oldest ones are from Africa. So I think it legitimately gives us a cause to say that not only did humankind evolve from Africa, but so did neurosurgery. Because it was. I mean, this is neurosurgery. This is surgery to the cranium. So the remarkable thing is, why would they do this? And again, probably because of things that we know, our biology today, were things that were thought to be mystical. So these were probably patients with epilepsy that they thought had some evil spirit in them, or patients with schizophrenia, or some other dramatic psychiatric condition in which their behavior was bizarre. And the idea, and we know this, probably from extrapolation to some other primitives, or what we call primitive societies, still today, or certainly in the last century, that these holes were drilled in the skull in anticipation that these spirits could get out of the body. The other amazing thing about this is that the patient survived. So we know that because the edges around the skull are all nice and rounded, so they survived, and some of them at least for months or years after the operation. And you've got to remember that general anesthesia to make surgery safe, and certainly neurosurgery, because neurosurgery was the last specialty to be conquered surgically. The advent of anesthesia, general anesthesia, was only in the 19th century. And so you know from movies that you've watched, doing surgery without anesthesia was terrible. And there are accounts of people who obviously survived the surgery who would talk about the horror of having the operation because nothing could prepare you for it. And most of the surgeries that were done pre-anesthesia were amputations. And this is where the surgeons got the reputation of having fast hands, because you had to be fast, because if you weren't fast, the patients wouldn't survive. So the goal was to do an amputation, so a below-knee amputation. You'd have to cut the skin, you'd have to cut the muscle, you had to saw through the bone, you've got to close the bleeders, and you've got to close the muscle and the bone. And the goal was to do that in 2 minutes. So that's where surgeons got a reputation of being good surgeons, because they were fast, because otherwise the patients wouldn't survive. So you'd give a guy a swig of happy juice, he'd bite on a leather thong, and 3 or 4 burly men would hold him down, and then you'd go in 2 minutes. And the people's, there were writings of people who obviously survived the operation, and they would talk about the horror, the absolute darkness of the agony of having an operation without anesthesia. And these were 4,000 years ago, so that's quite remarkable. And more so, they not only would make holes, but sometimes you'd have what are called depressed fractures from trauma, so a bit of the bone is broken, sometimes even driven in. They repaired it, and they put a gold plate there. And it seems like the nature of the plate had a relevance to the status in your society. So it was like an old version of the health plans on Discovery Health. So you think that's crazy, right? That people would make holes in the skull so that the spirits would go. But this is still a website. So there's a modern day, because these holes made in the skull are called trepanation. There's a modern day trepanation advocacy group. So these people get together, it must be illegal, and they talk about, and presumably do, drill holes in each other's skulls. I mean, that's the spectrum of humanity. So anyway, so I want to tell you a couple of stories just to generally set the scene for what's going to come next about the brain. And the first on that scene, I spoke a little bit about ancient Egypt and how they got it wrong with the heart. I spoke about ancient Greek and how they started getting it right at the Hippocrates, and then Aristotle kind of led them astray. But this man is the figure that looms greatest in the history of medicine in the 2nd century, Galen of Pergamon. And he, as you can see, he wasn't humble. I've done as much for modern medicine as Trajan did for the Roman Empire. It is I and I alone who has revealed the true path of medicine. So he must have been a surgeon, right? So Galen, but the problem was he was partly right. So as I said on Monday, you could back it up. And there's no one that comes close to Galen in terms of the amount of work that he produced and the impact that it had on the known world. So Galen produced 300 works, many of which survive today. So it's the largest body of work of any ancient author. Just one of his books had 800 pages long. And he was so definitive, and he was so authoritative, and clearly so confident, that he completely dominated modern medicine. And he was the greatest leap forward in modern medicine or ancient medicine. I guess there's a little bit of an interface between the two around about Galen. But he was also the greatest obstacle. And you'll find time and time again in a lot of the things that I say, and certainly in my thinking, there's always a double-edged sword to many things. In that he was the greatest leap forward, but the greatest obstacle. Why was it an obstacle? Because for more than a millennium, for 1400 years, nobody dared to question Galen. There was God, the Roman Catholic Church maybe, and then there was Galen. Such was his dominance. If Galen wrote it, that was biblical. And it kept medicine in the dark ages for 1400 years. Until this man came along. Second century. So this is a young man by the name of Andreas Vesalius, phenomenally committed. He studied as a physician. He was interested in dissection. He was interested in the human body to a degree that you and I would not understand. So he was at the University of Padua, which at the time was, so this is 16th century, but at the time was the center of the universe in terms of academia. And he happened to be there. He was the right person at the right time, uncommonly devoted, probably pathologically so. Recently there'd been a lifting of the moratorium, no pun intended, on human dissection or cadaver dissection. And he and his friends would sneak out of the city gates at night to go collect bodies. They were literally grave robbers and body snatchers, to go collect bodies from the graveyards of criminals who were buried in shallow graves. And then they'd haul that through the city walls, or sometimes he spent the whole night outside of the city walls because he couldn't get the body in. So he was so dedicated. And he was young, so he was appointed to professor of medicine at the University of Padua at the tender age of 23. So he was clearly bright, he clearly worked really, really hard, and he had a passion for it. And then what he slowly started realizing was that because he would do all these dissections himself, he just loved doing dissections. What he started realizing was that time and time again, there was this disconnect between what he was seeing and what Galen wrote. Because the practice was always that you did a dissection with the Bible next to you. That was Galen. And he kept time and time again that there was this disconnect between what he was seeing and what he was expecting to see based on what Galen wrote. And he came to the realization that Galen, for all his great contributions, and his contributions indeed were great, he had a scientific mind, there were just a few small things, few troubling things that he got wrong. And Vesalius came to the dawning realization that Galen had based his anatomy on animal dissections, not human dissections. And for the longest time, and this wasn't necessarily religious, there was indeed a moratorium on human dissection, which existed at the time of Galen. And a lot of the things that you'll learn from animals you can translate to humans, but there are some substantial differences. And then he wrote a book. It took 5 years. Gorgeously illustrated book. Vesalius is one of my all-time heroes. I got a chance to see a first copy at Yale last year, and I was like a fanboy. Gorgeously illustrated for its time. This really was a landmark publication, not only in its impact, but just in terms of its publication itself. The woodcuts were tremendous. You can imagine a woodcut of that. And unfortunately, it was destroyed in a library in Munich in 1944. It's just a horrible loss. But anyway, so he writes this book and he gets it published. And it completely upends 1,400 years of teaching in medicine. And so you would have, and he publishes it at the tender age of 27. The biggest shake-up to medicine in the history of medicine, because Galen had been so dominant. And so you would have thought that everybody would be rushing to him to congratulate him. This is marvelous, this is incredible, this has opened our minds. Not at all. Immediately that it was published, the knives started coming out. Because of course you can't question Galen. And probably the person who was most vicious was his own teacher. So his own teacher writes a book. This is the title of the book, A Refutation of the Slanders of a Madman Against the Writings of Hippocrates and Galen. And he says, now no academics can be quite ruthless, but this takes it to another level. It would have been easier to cleanse the Augean stables than to remove even the worst lies from this hodgepodge made up of thefts and bloated with slanders. This monster, born and bred in his own house, this worst example of ignorance, ingratitude, arrogance, and impiety, to suppress him so that he may not poison the rest of Europe with his pestilential breath, this crude and confused farrago of filth and sewage, this work wholly unworthy of your perusal, and consign it to Vulcan. Now you can tell he doesn't like Vesalius. And the criticisms against Vesalius were so brutal that they eventually broke him. So shortly after he published this book, he was a broken man. He gave it all up. So 5 years of feverish work that changed the course of history, and he completely gives it up. He makes a big show of burning all his notebooks in public, and he goes into the private sector. He becomes a physician to the Emperor of Rome, and then to the King of Spain, and he's lost to academia forever. And one of the terribly sad things later on in his life, he feels a need to come back to Padua, and he does. But on his way back to Padua, he gets shipwrecked on an island. He falls ill, and he dies alone. Such an ignominious death. It's terrible. But the other aspect of Vesalius was this, that in the same year, this is remarkable, 1543, the very same year, another landmark publication happens. And completely different. This is about the celestial heavens. And this was the work by Nicholas Copernicus, also amazingly from the University of Padua. So in the same year, you have these two groundbreaking works that completely shatter known science and known thinking at the time. One from a young 27-year-old, and one from a man literally at the end of his career, and in fact literally on his deathbed, because he died that same year, shortly after receiving the first printed copy. And this was his copy of De Revolutionibus Orbium Celestium, which essentially is the universe doesn't revolve around you. Which is amazing. And Copernicus at the age of 70, and Vesalius at the age of 27, two publications, both from the University of Padua, that completely changed modern history. Now that specifically doesn't have anything to do about the brain, but I do find it fascinating. And it does set a foundation for everything that's going to be coming afterwards. Now this, also a little bit off the brain, but again setting the foundation. Why? Because this is a man by the name of John Hunter, 18th century England. He was an English surgeon. And he did more for the legitimacy and the respect of surgery than anyone else, because he applied scientific rigor and experimentation to the art of surgery. and he made it respectable. But as a young child, he wasn't like that. So as a young child, he was a middling student. His teachers were worried about him. In retrospect, clearly he was a square peg in a round hole. He went to university, he dropped out of university in the first year. It wasn't for him. He was a kind of child who just loved to wander around in nature. And he was intensely curious about absolutely everything. How do things work? Why does this happen? Why do the leaves change in autumn? He was intensely curious, and he couldn't find an outlet for his passions. And then he lands up in London. He's got an older brother who's a physician. And probably like many older brothers, his mother said to him, look, sort out your young ruffian brother, because he needs some direction in life. His brother doesn't know what to do, so in exasperation, he gives him a job looking after the dissection lab, his dissection lab. And then John Hunter comes into the lab. He's amidst all these specimens and suddenly finds his home. Suddenly he finds his passion. He's just immensely fascinated by all these specimens. And so then he gets motivated. He becomes a doctor. He becomes a surgeon. And by his scientific rigor, and especially at the time in 18th century England, does the most amazing things. He described the collateral circulation. So the collateral circulation is if you block a vessel, other vessels can find a way around that. And that wasn't known. And he did it by experiment. He got a stag. So this is the amazing thing about him. He never lost his curiosity and everything else. So he bought a farm, and he had a menagerie of animals. So he had sheep and goats and rams and horses, as you'd expect. But he also had jackals and buffaloes and leopards. It was the most bizarre thing. So his experiment was on a stag. He blocked off the carotid artery and then discovered the collateral circulation. He described what is now still the basis of the modern classification of teeth. He did the first human artificial insemination, a successful one, and this was in the year 1776. It's completely amazing. And he was a driven man, and I wanted to tell you two stories, if I may. And now I'm running short of time, but if I may, they're just fascinating stories. May I tell you two stories about him? So one of them is about sexually transmitted diseases, if I may. So syphilis and gonorrhea were terrible diseases in 18th century England, as you'd imagine, incredibly common and dangerous as well, especially syphilis. If it escaped its organ of origin and it went northward, going to the brain, it would become a slow degenerative disease that would progressively addle the brain. So it's a horrible disease, and of course, there wasn't any definitive cure. So this was before the days of antibiotics. This was before the days we could make the joke of, what do you give a man who's got everything? Penicillin. So they didn't have penicillin. They had mercury. So mercury was a common application, topical mercury. And it was so common that it was a well-known maxim among young men that a night with Venus leads to a year with Mercury. And it was a common disease. So if you look, for instance, at France, and maybe France is not the best example, but France at one point, it was estimated that about 20% of their population had syphilis. 20%, so that's a really, really common disease. And of course, it would affect highborns and lowborns. It didn't discriminate. So for me, it's like the quintessential French disease. It's egalitarian, so it'll affect everybody. It comes from a certain degree of fraternization among the sexes and a somewhat libertarian approach to personal relationships. It's a terrible disease. But one of the things that wasn't known about syphilis and gonorrhea was whether they were the same disease or they were different diseases. And they had no way of proving that. And this was a question that vexed John Hunter. So he wanted to design an experiment. So to design an experiment, you've got to have a subject that gets inoculated, gets the disease, and then you've got to look at the manifestations of that disease. Does it look like syphilis? Does it look like gonorrhea? Unfortunately, he couldn't find any subjects. Nobody was willing to partake in that experiment. So he did, I think, what any self-respecting researcher would do. He took a lancet, he dipped it in some gonorrheal pus, and I think you might know where I'm going with this. He inoculated himself at the tip of his most sensitive organ. And the results of the experiment were satisfyingly good from an experimental point of view, of course. in that in a short time, he developed the full-blown manifestations, not only of syphilis, but of gonorrhea as well. So the irony was that his main thesis, his main hypothesis, he was wrong. So he concluded that syphilis and gonorrhea were the same thing. But the mistake that he made was that the patient that he got the gonorrheal pus from also, as was common of the day, had syphilis. But what made his publication a landmark one was that it was a wonderful demonstration of the methodology of being able to follow a disease and do detailed observations in one patient over a period of time. In his case, it was 3 years of drips and saws that he got for it. So he was uncommonly dedicated. The other story about him was the story that's become known as the story of the Irish giant. So there was a young man by the name of Charles Byrne who was from a small town in north of Ireland, and by the age of 19 he was already 8 foot 2 inches. And he was a curiosity in his local town, so as a novelty he used to make a bit of money at various fairs. And he fell in with a promoter, and the promoter said, "Hey, got to take you to London, you can make so much more money." So he brought him to London. He became famous as this traveling giant. Everybody wanted to go see him. He was living the high life. It was very different from Ireland. He took to drinking. His drinking got worse. And as his novelty faded, because people had seen him by now, as his novelty faded, he started drinking more and more and more. Until his health started to suffer, and he developed pulmonary tuberculosis, which in many cases was fatal at the time. And for him, it was headed towards that. He was in declining health. It was clear that his death was imminent. Now, John Hunter had heard and seen this guy, and he was fascinated with him. He thought probably that he probably had acromegaly, which is a tumor of the pituitary gland. He was fascinated with him, and he wanted his skeleton. He knew he was going to die. He wanted his skeleton. So he sent his right-hand man, so to speak, to inquire and follow this man's, the Irish giant's, health. So now the Irish giant hears about it. And this is a guy who's facing his impending death, and he's got to deal with this fact that this famous surgeon, aptly named Hunter, wants his skeleton. So he gets completely freaked out by this and goes to the undertaker and says to the undertaker, "I want you to sign a contract with me where you swear, and this is my money, that you swear that John Hunter will not get my body, that it will be a public burial at sea." So the undertaker signs a contract and gets paid. John Hunter hears that this contract was signed. So he goes to the undertaker under the cover of night. And he sits down with him in a room and he says, "Okay, so what's it going to take?" So he puts some money on the table. Undertaker looks at it. And then he goes to another room and he confers with his other undertakers. You can imagine this all under the cover of night. And then he comes back into the room and he says to John Hunter, "Look, I'm sorry, but I'm an ethical man. I've written a contract." So John Hunter doubles the money, and he says, "Well, if it's for the purposes of science, after all." So he goes into a deal with John Hunter, and he says, "You'll get the skeleton." So Charles Byrne eventually dies, but of course the undertaker's got this written contract with him. So they make a big show of his funeral. They build a custom-made casket, of course, because he's over 8 foot. They nail it closed. And then they put it on a horse and cart, and they take it down to the local port, because then they're going to put it on a ship, and he's going to get buried at sea. So there are 10 pallbearers that are with him. So they go down, and as there is always at a port, there's always a tavern. So the undertaker says to the pallbearers, "Listen, this is thirsty work. I've got some money here. You guys have done a hard job. Go have a drink. Don't worry. I'll sort out the casket. We'll lock it in the shed. And then once you've had a drink, we'll get it back on the ship." And so he does that, locks it, makes a big show of locking the shed. They go have a drink. The undertaker's underling comes along with a key to the shed. There are tools already buried in the shed. They open it up. They prise off the lid of the casket. They take the body out. There are a few of them that have to carry it out. And they fill the casket with rocks. and they close it up again, and they lock the shed. After the pallbearers have had their drink, they come back to the shed, they pick up the casket, still feels the same, well, they've had a bit of a drink now. They put it on the ship, and he gets buried at sea. And John Hunter gets his skeleton. And in fact, this is the skeleton there. It's still at the Hunterian Museum in London. It's the skeleton of the Irish giant. Okay, now that sets the scene of this enormous dedication, both in the science of medicine as well as in surgery. So what have we learned about the brain? So one of the celebrated cases, and there's a consistency through all these cases, that we've learned about how various parts of the brain function when they're not functioning. And that's the only way that we figure out what the function of that particular portion of the brain is. So Phineas Gage was probably the best example of that, or one of the best examples of that. So Phineas Gage was a young man. He was in his early 20s, and he was a dockyard worker. So his job was for exploding bedrock. So essentially what they do is they drill holes in bedrock, they'd fill it with gunpowder, and his job was to take a rod like that, called a tamping rod, and tamp down the gunpowder. Obviously you've got to be expert at it. He was particularly good at it. He'd been doing it for a long time. He was elevated to a level of a foreman, even though he was quite young. But just on a particular day, while he was tamping it down, he may have been distracted, we don't know. He tamps it down a little too hard, maybe it strikes a little bit of a rock, it causes a spark, there's gunpowder in that. That explodes, the tamping rod shoots up through the air, it lands 50 yards down the shore, but en route, it goes in through his cheekbone and out the top of his head. So, of course, everybody's attention is drawn to this explosion. They see Phineas fall to the ground, twitching. They run to him, they try to revive him. And the most amazing thing is he revives. So he's had this thing that's gone through his brain, but he survives. And he goes to his doctor, or at least the neurologist, and they're amazed this guy is alive. And he seems no worse for the wear. He's awake, he's talking, moving arms and legs, everything seems to be fine. But then over time they realize he looks fine, but he isn't. And this was the first time that we realized the functions of the frontal lobe. And we spoke a little bit about that on Monday. That the frontal lobe is your rational thinking, your judgment, your knowledge of how to behave in a societal context. And he wasn't the same person. His personality had changed. He was impulsive. He was apathetic. He lost initiative. His judgment was shot. He gambled away all of his money. In fact, he was there, he was living, breathing, everything was working, but he wasn't the same person. And that was the first indication that we had of the functions of the frontal lobe. I told you about the speech centers on Monday. I told you their speech is on the left side. We didn't know that. So in 19th century, we didn't know that. There was no idea of the lateralization of function in the brain. And in fact, anybody who spoke about lateralization was shunned because they were coming out in mid to late 19th century, they were coming out of a period called Phrenology. I don't know if you've heard of Phrenology. It was a dark period of medicine where clinicians really believed, and they exploited this for political purposes, really believed that you could tell somebody's intelligence and likelihood of conducting criminal behavior based on their physiognomy, the lumps and bumps on the head. So it was a strong argument for instance, a racial bias in intelligence and a racial bias in criminality. And that eventually got debunked, but it lasted for a long time. So anybody coming along, talk about lateralization in the brain, they thought this was Phrenology 2.0. Until this man, Paul Broca, so he was a neurologist, and one day a friend of his, a doctor, calls him up and says, he's had this guy that's come in. So this was in France, in Paris. This guy had come in, he's a young guy, and he's terribly, terribly depressed. Being French, He's young, he's in Paris, probably was in love, maybe his lover left him. And he decided to end it all. And he decided to shoot himself in the head. And he tried to shoot himself on the left side. But as we see sometimes with suicides to the head, there's often a flinching at the last minute. And he obviously flinched, so he got caught a glancing blow on the left side. So he comes into the doctor. Again, everything seems to be working. He's awake, he's talking, he's moving everything, and except that he's got this big gaping wound, and there's some brain hanging out. So the doctor's appalled by it, and so he's trying to clean it up, and while he's trying to clean it up, the guy's talking to him, and he takes a spatula, one of those metal spatulas, like tongue depressors, but metal. So, he's got to, there's brain hanging out here, he's got to do something about it. So he puts the metal spatula on that part of the brain. So this is on the left, just where you can see it. That's actually his brain. And he pushes it slightly out of the way because he wants to get it back in the wound. And as he does that, the guy's talking to him and he suddenly stops talking. He's got speech arrest. And so the doctor gets a fright and he pulls away, and then the guy starts talking again. So what would you do in that situation? Of course, that's exactly what he did. He thought, okay, that's interesting. So he takes a spatula and he puts it there again. And the guy stops talking. He takes it away. He does that a couple of times. And it's very clear that pressure on that area causes speech arrest. So he gives Paul Broca a call, who's, as I said, a neurologist. And that very day they presented at the Academy of Sciences in Paris. But nobody pays any attention to it. They think this is another version of phrenology. Until Broca has another patient, in a short while after that, who has a stroke. And that stroke happens to be in that very same area. And the thing that he presents with is the inability to speak. And then on the basis of that, Paul Broca ended up doing the first operation. Based on lateralization, he operated on a brain tumor, and he knew where the brain tumor was because the person couldn't speak. And so that was the first indication that we knew that speech isn't bilaterally represented in the brain, and it's in specific areas. In fact, there's one area there, the left frontal lobe, and then one area in the posterior temporal lobe. And then we come to quite a dark period of surgery or neurology. And this started with a Portuguese neurologist by the name of Antonio Moniz. He was a bright and incredibly dedicated neurologist who eventually received the Nobel Prize for medicine. And he did several amazing things. He gave us cerebral angiography. Cerebral angiography is when you inject contrast into the blood vessels and you can follow it anywhere in the body. And we utilize that all the time in neurosurgery. It's a very, very useful technique. So it was a major contribution. But he's also, and I said there's very often a double-edged sword, he's also the father of psychosurgery. So what happened with him was that he became aware of some work that was being done in Yale on chimpanzees where the frontal lobes were taken out, and they were completely changed. They were more controlled, they were a lot calmer, they were manageable. And he put that together with stories or patients that he was seeing returning from the war with injuries to the frontal lobe with a change in personality. And his interest was mental illness, and he came up with the hypothesis that the frontal lobes are the seat of our personality and of mental illness. And that if you disconnect fibers of the frontal lobe, you can cure mental illness. He wasn't a surgeon, so he got a surgeon on board. They did 20 patients. An operation called the Frontal Leucotomy. So they did an operation, it was an open operation. They put a blade in and they cut the fibers of the frontal lobe on both sides. And the results that they reported was that 7 patients were cured, 7 patients improved, and for the 6 others there was no change. Now he's received a lot of criticism in later years about not disclosing all the complications and not following up these patients in the long run. But he started psychosurgery. And then as often it happens, it really takes off when it hits America. And so this man, Walter Friedman, he was a neurologist. Actually, his license had been revoked because a patient of his had died. So he got another neurosurgeon to come on board with him, and they started doing this procedure, except they now called it a lobotomy, not a frontal leucotomy. They called it a frontal. Technically, it's not a lobotomy, but the name stuck. So they racked up very quickly 200 patients, and they published it, and they said the results were good in at least 2/3 of patients. And then what really took off what really made it take off was that he learnt of operations that an Italian neurosurgeon was doing, where he'd operate on the brain, but very quickly and directly through the orbit. So the base of the skull over the orbit is in fact very, very thin. It's easy to fracture. And this guy was getting into the frontal lobe very quickly, directly through the orbit, with no general anesthesia, no big operation. So he thought this was great. And so he started a procedure called a frontal lobotomy, but using what's called the ice pick technique. So literally this is what they would do. They would go there above the eye, in the eye socket, and with a couple of quick taps of a hammer, an instrument very much like an ice pick was driven into the brain. Once it was in, they'd swish it this way and then that way, and they'd cut the fibers connecting the frontal lobe to the limbic system, the hypothalamus, etc. And the great thing for Freeman was that this was a procedure that could be done under local anesthesia, and it could be done in 10 minutes. So it's a quick operation. And then it took off. And then he started traveling across the whole of the US, doing these procedures. Even in his office, he'd visit all the mental illnesses because parents and family relatives were completely desperate with their relatives with schizophrenia, with personality disorders, with severe anxiety and major depression, and they would bring them to Walter Freeman in droves. And if that wasn't worrying enough, they also brought people who were completely normal. So a large number of the patients that he ended up were people who were homosexuals. And their families wanted their sexual orientation to be changed, and they thought that surely that must be in the frontal lobe. In his career, he operated on supervised more than 4,000 patients, 19 of whom were children, one of whom was 4 years old at the time. He even operated on John F. Kennedy's sister and left her with a mental deficit and a physical deficit. And so controversy started building. Many of his patients died of cerebral hemorrhage, so they eventually shut him down. But he wasn't the only person. In the 1940s and the 1950s, there were about it's estimated there were about 50,000 of these operations that were done. And of course, they didn't follow up these patients very well. And because your frontal lobes are so connected to your personality, sometimes they'd cure the outward manifestations of psychiatry, but they change those people forever. In many cases, completely robbing them of their personality. Not that it would necessarily have been justified if a patient was schizophrenic, but on top of that, these were people, like with homosexuals, who were completely normal. And it was a dark, dark time, and not that long ago. Now, eventually, psychosurgery in many parts of the world have been completely abandoned and banned. There's still some places where it gets done, but it's very, very different. And it's always under very, very strict controls as part of a university project. And it's not this kind of operation. The typical operations now are inserting an electrode in very specific parts of the brain, and they're not destructive electrodes, they're stimulating electrodes. And they have some results, and we can talk about that a little bit later. But this was a particularly dark time. And then two more situations I'd love to talk about if I have the time. So this was Roger Sperry. He was a neurophysiologist and neuropsychologist, mainly in experimental work, but his fascination was the corpus callosum. We spoke about the corpus callosum on Monday. That's that broad swath of fibers that connects the left and the right hemisphere. Left and right hemispheres are slightly different. The corpus callosum helps those two hemispheres to talk to each other all the time. incredibly valuable, more than 200 million fibers in the corpus callosum. That's what it looks like from the front, and you can get there quite easily. You separate the hemispheres, and you get in down to the corpus callosum. From the side, this is what it looks like. And I told you also about epilepsy. So epilepsy usually starts on one side of the brain, often in the hippocampus, but not always. And then what happens is that there's this massive discharge of electricity that goes to the other side of the brain, mostly through the corpus callosum. And then the patient falls down, falling sickness, they jerk, a grand mal seizure or tonic-clonic seizure. They lose consciousness. It can be a devastating and very dangerous condition. So some patients are desperate to have something done. And one of the operations that one can do is to cut the corpus callosum. So that makes sense, right? Because if you cut the corpus callosum, the seizures can generate on one side, but they can't travel to the other side and therefore land up with a generalized seizure. So that makes sense, and it does make sense. We still do the operation. I've done it a few times, but slightly different from what they did it back in the day. So back in the day, they took this is the corpus callosum section through the middle. And they cut the whole of the corpus callosum. From the front to the back, they split the whole thing. And so I'll show you what it looks like. I don't think it should be squeamish-inducing, but if this is a trigger warning, if any of you don't like it, just close your eyes now. But this is what it looks like. So this is the hemisphere, pinkish. That's the corpus callosum, very white. This is turned on its side now. This is the corpus callosum cut. You're getting into the ventricle there. It's generally quite easy to do. But we would cut just the anterior portion of the corpus callosum. So these were operations that would be done for epilepsy, patients who were completely desperate, and it worked. And they generally thought that the people were fine, the patients were fine, but they weren't absolutely convinced. So they got Roger Sperry, two LA surgeons who were doing corpus callosotomies. They got Roger Sperry to come up to LA and to test the patients. And Sperry and his student, gentleman by the name of Michael Gazzaniga, who's also become a neuroscientist in his own right, he's written a couple of really good books. They devised a couple of really cool experiments. I told you about the visual system in the brain, that you get visual signs through both of your eyes, but they cross. But the way that they cross is interesting, because what crosses to the right is everything on the left visual side, both for the left eye and the right eye. So the left eye gets the left visual field coming there. The right eye gets the left visual field on that side, and they come, and so both the left visual field information goes over to the right hemisphere. And on the other side, the left eye gets right visual field on the green, and this side gets right visual field on the green as well, and then crosses over to the left side. So the eyes are communicating, they're mixing, but it's always the things on your left go to the right, and things on your right go to the left. So what they did, they devised actually quite an ingenious experiment, for which Roger Sperry actually got the Nobel Prize for medicine. And they were simple experiments, but they were really well thought out. And so one of the things that they would do was they'd have a board in front of patients, and they would, so this is after the callosotomy, they would flash a word or an image on that board, but they'd flash it just long enough for it to register in the left visual field, for instance, or the right visual field, but not long enough that the patients actually turn their eyes towards it. So that they see it, they'd register it because it's in the visual field, but it will only be in the left visual field. It wouldn't be thrown by the patient actually looking at it. And so what they found was that when they flashed on the right side, where's the information going to go? It's going to go to the left hemisphere. When they flashed a word, dog, cat, kitchen, automobile, the people say, so they asked them to do two things. One was to sound out the word or the image, and the other thing was to tap their hand. So when they found when they flashed it into the right visual field to the left hemisphere, they'd say dog, cat, kitchen, automobile. But when they flashed it to the right hemisphere, they'd say nothing. They'd say, no, I didn't see it. I didn't see anything.